On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, it's the January 10th, 2022 edition of What the Ship, the top 5 news stories in the maritime sector. Hi, I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to this week's edition of What the Ship, top 5 stories in the maritime sector. We got a lot to talk about. You would think the beginning of 2022, things would have calmed down, but they sure haven't. So we're going to jump right into our stories. But before we do that, just want to remind you of some stories we went over the past week. In case you missed them over the holiday New Year time period, we had 4 big stories that we hit. We had a historical one, the submarine blitzkrieg against North America and the U.S. response. This was a presentation I gave up in September at the American Merchant Marine Veterans Convention. We did a story on liquefied natural gas tankers, the Jones Act in New England, talking about the issue of why are foreign LNG tankers coming into Boston. We did a second episode of the Shipping Notes, short videos on maritime history and news. This one looks specifically at how Maersk has toppled as the largest container liner, and we talked about the size and capability of the 9 big shipping companies that handle 83% of the world's container shippings. We even broke out the big Lego blocks. And then finally, we had Jay Mintzmeyer from Value Investors Edge on to talk about what the ship stock is going on, talking about the different sectors in the maritime fields and what the prognosis is looking at 2022. So if you hadn't caught any of those videos, be sure to go take a look at them. We'll have them in the show notes. And of course, they'll be available if you subscribe, hit the bell so that when new videos come out, you'll be alerted about them. So let's go ahead and jump into story number 1. Story number 1 takes us to the port of Seattle. This story just out. Terminal 5 on Harbor Island hosts first container ship since renovation. Phase 1 now complete. This story is talking about the fact that the port of Seattle has improved its terminal. Specifically, the Northwest Seaport Alliance and SSA Marine announced on Friday that phase of the Terminal 5 renovation is now open and welcomed its first ship, the MSC Monterey. It goes on here to talk about phase 1 of Terminal 5 is open for cargo ships. The Monterey is the first vessel to call the newly modernized terminal with 4 new superposed Panamax cranes ready to work the ship. The Terminal 5 modernization program launched in 2016 to expand gateway cargo capacity and enable the Northwest Seaport Alliance to service the largest vessels in the Trans-Pacific trade. If we go over to Terminal 5, you got some images right here. This is Terminal 5 right here. You'll see they had a series of gantry cranes here, 5 of them, but those were designed for smaller vessels. The area in question is this area right here. And I believe you got a better picture of it here. There we go. You'll see they expanded this area here. They reinforced the pier. And then most importantly, they brought in 4 big ZPMC cranes that can now handle post-Panamax vessels. And this story right here from the terminal talks all about it, the bringing in the cranes, standing 316 feet tall, 240-foot reach. These cranes will be among the largest on the West Coast and able to handle the biggest container vessels operating the world once Terminal 5 is completed early next year. Well, we know it's completed because the MSC Monterey is right there up against the berth as we see it. This is our buddies at Marine Traffic. Now, most vessels have been going into these terminals right here. If you follow some people on Twitter, you'll see container vessels being brought into this narrow area right here. And you'll see they have limited area to work containers. One of the big issues in container ship operation, there's a couple of limitations. There are draft limitations, both water draft and air draft. There are the cranes. The crane's got to be tall enough. The cranes have to be long enough to reach out there. But most importantly, you need a lot of lay down area for the containers. The bigger the ship, the more lay down area you need. And what Terminal 5 is this massive area right here. You see a couple of things here in Terminal 5 that should stand out. Highway access right here, railway access right here. These are the older cranes that are down. Oops, sorry. These are the older cranes that are down here. See them casting their shadow down there. The 6 of them, the 4 larger ones are all up here. And here you see MSC Monterey. Looks like she may be trying to get underway at this time, but you have this huge laydown area right here where this port is going to be able to handle much more cargo. Big news. big expansion we've seen. The last expansion we saw on the West Coast was the LBCT terminal down in Long Beach. Now Terminal 5 here in Seattle. Question is, will the shipping companies take advantage of this? We saw that Boston just recently did this. They expanded, dredged the port, brought in 4 big cranes, and unfortunately, Boston has been blanked in sailings for the past couple of months, losing out in vessels. Hopefully, this won't be the case in the port of Seattle. So that's story number 1. Story number 2 builds on the story we talked about last week. If you remember last week, we were talking about the CDC and cruise lines. Specifically, we were talking about the fact that the CDC has issued these cruise ship color status for every cruise ship out there: green, orange, yellow, red, gray. It's great that they've recycled the old Homeland Security advisory system, and now they're out there doing this for CDC. But in this case, it's not terrorism. It has to do with COVID, particularly the Omicron variant. Well, the latest story here out of Reuters on G-Captain talks about the fact that Royal Caribbean pauses sailings due to Omicron concerns. And what we've seen here is the major cruise lines have all reacted to this new COVID crisis. We are hitting record infections in the United States right now. Omicron not as deadly as the Delta variant, we know that, but it is much more transmittable. We'll go with that word. It can be spread a lot easier. And so right from the very beginning, we're seeing it. So Royal Caribbean announcing their delay. Other stories coming out here as cruise lines scramble to manage this crisis. Is a story out from Maritime Executive. And then also this report, which I thought was the most probably damning of them all. Every US-based cruise ship with passengers has reported COVID-19 cases on board. It's not clear whether or not we're not going to have this go on for a long time. But the cruise lines had just gotten themselves backed up, ramped up again to get going again. And now they're slammed back down again. And this is going to have obviously impacts across the entire cruise ship sector, a sector that's been hit really hard by COVID and trying to get started back up again. We've seen lots of scrappings of older ships. We've seen some consolidations. But fortunately, the cruise ship industry is huge. It's massive. It has a lot of inventory in terms of vessels. It's got a lot of vessels on the way, too. And so they're going to do whatever they can to get this back up and running. It's going to be interesting to see what exactly they do, whether they start reducing numbers of passengers on the vessels, whether they start instituting mask options again. It's really tough for them to get going. But we're definitely seeing the cruise ship suffer here. And that's story number 2. Story number 3 deals with pressure on the supply chain. So one of the things we started seeing at the end of 2021 was some stories come out there saying that, okay, we're reaching the end of 2021, the holiday season is over, and we're going to start seeing some relief on the supply chain. Even had the Secretary of Commerce come out and talk about the fact that, according to her metrics, we have, mitigated the supply chain crisis by 50%. Well, here's a story by Greg Miller over at American Shipper on FreightWaves talking about how a new index put out by the New York Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, says that it's really high, measuring the supply chain crisis. Now, what I was really interested about this story that Greg did is there was a lot of stories about this Federal Reserve Bank from New York study that came out and this new measurement they were using. And one of the things that the Fed of New York sat there and said was, it's at the highest level it's ever been. Therefore, it has to be coming down. It can't go higher. Greg does not take that interpretation at all. Matter of fact, Greg takes an interpretation I agree with, that it may go higher still. And matter of fact, there was just another measurement came out, this time from the St. Louis Fed, that's a little bit different on this. But Greg's story here, I think, is really important because it looks at this supply chain pressure index. And it looks at it from 1997 all the way to 2021. You see the peak here after 2008 and it kind of kicking back up. And then you get into the COVID era here and using the measurements they use in here. And you can read the story for how they break this up. It has a link over to the New York Fed story. But one of the things that you see here is it really peaked early in 2020, dropped early in 2021 and back up again. And what I'm concerned about is it's going to do this sine wave again. It will drop down, but then it's going to peak back up again in 2022 as we hit Chinese New Year, as we hit the ILWU labor renegotiations. And one of the things that's in this story, and this is a great story, and I really recommend you read Greg's story. I got the whole story on here for you to look at. He has other measurements in here that really breaks this down and some more. He talks about the different indexes and you name it. He's got the Drury World Container Index, talks about ships off the port here. But what he is talking about here is there's a lot of issues behind the chain. Just to give you a quick little tidbit here, I'm going to run a couple of stories right past you real quick. But just to give you an idea of the pressures the global supply chain are under. Number one, story by Greg that talks about the logjam at all the major ports, not just LA and Long Beach, but all the ports around the United States at New Year's. Ship owners show ocean carriers desperate for tonnage, no mercy. The chartering for vessels, all-time high. The chartering of container vessels in particular, all-time high for it. We're seeing issues in Chinese ports. China tightens restrictions near key port amid new virus cases. It's a Bloomberg story. We get this story right here. These are all coming out of G-Captain. Port trucker Snarl hits Ningbo container terminal. Containergeddon hits New York as COVID cases spike. And again, a whole series of these. Ningbo port, partial closure, more than just vessel berthing. These are a couple of stories here from Lorianne LaRocco. Ningbo port congestion grows amid COVID crackdown. And then finally, this one from Container News, Tianjin port tests all workers as partial lockdown imposed. We're seeing pressure in ports throughout the world. So this is going to have butterfly, accordion, whatever you want to call it, effects down the supply chain. And we're seeing this now, which means that we've already got a huge backlog of vessels. I could show you the backlog of vessels off LA and Long Beach. The ships are sitting there off the coast of Mexico now. They've moved down to Baja because they can get in the lee of the land there. They can get out of the ocean current and sit there. But we've got record numbers of vessels down there. And all that comes back to this issue right here of how this spike goes down. Even if this spike falls down to the lowest level it was during the COVID era, notice how high it is compared to the past. So we still have major pressure on the supply chain. And again, I don't want to, cry wolf, the sky is falling type stuff. But when people come out and sit there and say, we're past the worst of it and things are going to get better, well, yeah, we may be past the worst of it, but we're nowhere near to where we were pre-COVID. And that needs to be understood. So that's story number 3. Story number 4 is one of those stories that is absolutely vital in shipping, but doesn't break into the mainstream news the way it should be. On January 1st, 2022, Indonesia stopped exporting coal. This story, a Reuters story in G-Captain, kind of talks about it in some detail. It's not a very big story, but it covers some major issues here. Indonesia is yet to reach a decision on lifting its coal export ban as authorities discussed overcoming logistical issues that have slowed efforts to distribute coal to domestic power plants, a mining group executive said on Saturday. Goes on to say the world's biggest thermal coal exporter suspended coal exports January 1st after Indonesia's state power utility reported dangerously low inventory of the fuel, putting Southeast Asia's biggest economy on the brink of widespread power outages. Now, many power generating facilities in Asia in particular are run on coal. And the fact that Indonesia has stopped exporting coal is significant. This is the review of maritime transport done by UNCTAD. They have a section in here that I always find particularly interesting. And that is this section right here. Let me remove my big head. So right here, this is table 1.7, major dry bulk and steel producers, users, exporters, and importers. So it shows you by percentage who consumes what, who is the biggest steel producers, who's the biggest steel users. And again, notice China is both. The 56% produce the world's steel and 50% uses the world's steel. But as you go down here and you look at, for example, iron ore, China is the biggest consumer of iron ore, 76%. Who's the biggest exporter? Australia, 58%, Brazil, 23%. But the next one is coal. And that is, to me, the significant one. When you look at the coal exports here, this is the big issue. China imports 20% of the world coal, India 19%, Japan 14%, Korea 10%. This is a massive, massive element right here. You're talking about 73% of the world's coal go to those four countries. If you throw in Taiwan and Malaysia, you're talking about almost 80%. Almost 80%. It's a huge amount going in here. So we're talking about huge amount of coal that's going to those areas. Who's the largest exporter? Indonesia, 35%. And a large chunk of that Indonesian coal is going to China, to India, to Japan, to Korea, to Taiwan, to Malaysia. And so when India announces this, it has massive impact. Now, China traders shrug off Indonesian coal export ban. This is the story that's coming out of Reuters right here. Coal traders in China, the world's top consumer and importer of fuel, are shrugging off a ban on coal exporters imposed by Indonesia, saying utilities already hold hefty stockpiles with power demand set to weaken for the Lunar New Year. Coal stocks at key Chinese utilities in coastal regions were about 33 million tons as of January 1, 57% more than the same time last year. Plus, we know that China has been shifting a lot of its power plants from coal to LNG, but we also know that LNG is being diverted from China over to Europe because of the fact that Russian gas is not being shipped into Europe. What this means for everybody is that these issues right here about power and fuel consumption are critical. And if you look at how a lot of economic trade wars begin and even conflicts themselves, it happens over resources, particularly fuel resources. This other story here goes into it from Maritime Executive. Bulkers wait offshore as Indonesia prepares to lift coal export ban. So there's a huge wait here to see if Indonesia is going to lift this ban and get coal moving again. And this impacts, obviously, power production in many countries across Asia. That is story number 4. Story number 5. Would you like to supersize that? No. Too bad. McDonald's in Japan are facing a critical issue, a critical shortage of potatoes. Talked about this in some previous videos, but here's this Reuters story. Yes, Reuters is talking about McDonald's fries. So when you go out in America and you go out to eat for dinner or lunch, you may talk about getting Chinese food, Italian food, Mexican food. In Japan, if you talk about American food, it's McDonald's. And McDonald's has big sales across Japan. However, as this story shows, coming from Reuters, Japanese customers will have to settle for a small serving of McDonald's fries for the next month or so after the fast food chain says it is limiting portions due to shipping problems. McDonald's holding company Japan sent a statement on Friday that the impact of flood damage on the Port of Vancouver, remember we talked about this quite a bit, the Fraser River Valley cut off the major rail lines and highways, leading to a massive backlog that is still there at the Port of Vancouver, has now resonated down to this. Other disruptions since last year would delay an expected shipment of potatoes from North America. Global shipping operations continue to be severely affected by a mix of factors, including COVID-19 pandemic, lockdowns, extreme weather, and a rapid recovery in demand. This story, I think, is fascinating on multiple levels. Flexport, which is a major freight forwarder down in Southern California, chartered 3 747s to fly potatoes from North America to Japan to meet this shortfall. Now, these potatoes were going out of Vancouver, but it's interesting to note that, again, we are still shipping 3 empties to 1 full container out of West Coast ports. Why these potatoes can't be shifted out of Seattle, Tacoma, out of Oakland. Oakland is trying very hard to do this. Matter of fact, there was a story just the other day about Oakland really trying to get agricultural exporters to come to their port, or Southern California, to get these across. Even if you don't get them directly to Japan, you get them to China, Shanghai, Ningbo, Tianjin, and then it could be put into a feeder vessel and then reshipped over to Japan. But again, this is a critical issue. The issue here is not whether you can get supersized fries in McDonald's. The issue here is whether Americans can export their goods. And we see that time and again. This Bloomberg story on G Captain, White House port envoy says nation needs to guard exports from supply chain snarls. John Picari, let's start with potatoes. Potatoes should be your measurement right here. And these other stories all build on this. Sam Chambers at Splash 24/7, containers taking twice as long to reach their destination compared to pre-pandemic period. Again, container liners are making record profit, yet their reliability, their ability to deliver goods on time are at all-time lows. And then you have the FMC coming in here with regulatory capacity. Hard to imagine the chaos. Talking with John Butler of the World Shipping Council. This is a terrible picture they put up here. I don't know why they did this, but this is just terrible. Talking about this issue, and they did this interview with him with FreightWaves, talking about the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2021. Hint, he does not like it. But then you also see the FMC doing these probes into detention and demurrage. In this case, probe into Hauppauge Lloyd. D&D could set industry precedent back. I assume it's detention, demurrage, and not their ability to play Dungeons and Dragons. So that is story number 5. So a plethora of stories there. This episode was not as comical as the last episode. I've received many comments back on my acting ability. I appreciate that. Nice for you all to chime in. But I do hope you found this video interesting and informative. I think right across the bat, got to be very careful going into 2022. You know, I had that great talk with Jay Mintzmeyer talking about stocks. We had that conversation with John Conrad from G Captain at the end of 2021, talking about prospects for 2022. And I think everybody is hedging their bet that while 2022 will not be as bad as 2021, it's not going to be great either. We're going to have serious supply chain issues going forward. And again, we're seeing that across the board. We're getting ready for Chinese Lunar New Year on February 1st. That'll slow everything coming out of China. We know the ports are already shutting down and slowing down, having fewer goods coming out of it. That is going to cause a tsunami of ships coming out. Remember, Asian ports are a lot more productive than American ports. They're going to be able to put a lot more boxes on vessels a lot faster than we can offload and process them. Doing a video coming up that's going to feature that and talk about that. That's going to be an issue. Then you have the ILWU labor renegotiation on the West Coast. If they cannot get that agreement hashed out by March or April, everybody in the world is going to push forward their shipments coming to the West Coast to get it here before the end of June and a potential labor strike. And then we're into the holiday year, and it's back on like Donkey Kong. So it's going to be an interesting 2022 coming forward. And if you want to stay abreast of these information, please subscribe. Hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos when they come out. Give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, share it across social media. And if you can, please contribute to our Patreon page. I appreciate all the support I get. It's going to be busy for me coming up, getting ready to start an academic school year again. I'm going to try to keep the videos coming as much as I can, but it's tough during my regular academic school year. But we will definitely have our Monday episodes of What the Ship coming up. We'll definitely do a weekend episode and probably at least try to do 1, if not 2 episodes else that week. We may have to go from a Wednesday, Friday to maybe just a Thursday format, but we're going to try to keep going. And in particularly when news hits in the shipping sector, I'll be on the air here fairly shortly afterwards to give you my take and as good of information as I can get on the subject. So until our next video, Sal signing off.